Oi, gente. Boa noite. Eu sou Fernanda, professora da FGV Energia. A gente está aqui hoje com o Francisco Monaldi, um colega meu da Rice University de Houston. Ele gentilmente aceitou nosso convite hoje para falar sobre a crise na América Latina para essa aula do MBA da turma de óleo e gás. E eu abri esse convite para vários convidados. O Francisco também abriu para os convidados dele. Então, hoje a gente vai ter uma aula assim, em vários idiomas. Eu não sei se vai ser bem em inglês, se vai ser bem em português, se vai ser bem em espanhol. A ideia é que a gente faça como nas outras aulas, as aulas anteriores, extras, né, que a gente teve aqui no MBA. O Francisco vai falar um pouco sobre essa temática que a gente colocou em relação à crise na América Latina, né? A gente estava até conversando um pouquinho antes. Na América Latina, o Brasil ele compete pelos investimentos com outros países latino-americanos, né? Ele compete com a Argentina, ele compete com a Colômbia, ele compete com o México, ele compete com o Peru. E cada país tem o seu regramento, tem a sua colocação hoje, e a gente não sabe exatamente, a gente acompanha as notícias, a gente acompanha o que acontece, mas eu pedi que o Francisco, como um expert da Rice University, que é parceira da FGV Energia, trouxesse a visão dele como um especialista em América Latina, como um especialista na economia venezuelana, que trouxesse essa expertise para a gente hoje, para esse posicionamento latino-americano, nessa questão de geopolítica para a gente, mais especificamente de petropolítica, né, que é um termo que eu gosto muito de usar, que é um termo muito afeto para mim. Na verdade, eu não tenho muito o que falar hoje, a minha ideia é só apresentar. O Francisco, então, é fellow e diretor do Centro de Estudos em América Latina da Rice University. A gente tem alguns avisos de housekeeping. Isso é uma aula, não é um webinar, na verdade, então tem uma dinâmica um pouquinho diferente. As perguntas vocês mandem pelo bate-papo, ou quem for meu aluno me mande pelo WhatsApp também, não tem problema. O Francisco vai falar entre meia hora, 40 minutos, depois a gente abre para perguntas. Eu vou pedir para vocês manterem os seus microfones desligados, eu não vou ficar controlando aqui, não é o objetivo, eu nem tenho ferramentas, isso é uma sala de aula, como eu falei. Que vocês mantenham os vídeos desligados para o streaming ficar melhor aqui, e vocês mantenham os seus microfones desligados também. Para os demás, que son alumnos de Francisco y que vinieron del lado de allá, muy buenas tardes para ustedes, ya casi buenas noches aquí en Brasil. Yo soy Fernanda de FGV Energy. Con mucho gusto que recibo aquí Francisco, un amigo muy querido, para hablarnos de América Latina y la disputa esta de inversiones en América Latina, para decirnos cómo posicionar Brasil de entre Argentina, entre México, Perú, Colombia, Venezuela. ¿Cómo lo hacemos? ¿Cómo lo ves la crisis en América Latina? Para ustedes que llegaron, por favor, mantengan sus micrófonos desligados, sus cámaras desligadas. Esa es una clase, en realidad no es un webinario como de estos 3 millones que hacemos todos los días, ¿no? Entonces, por favor, no tengo cómo controlar todo eso. Mándenme preguntas por el bate-papo. Y aquí seguimos. Francisco, muchísimas gracias. En nombre de FGV Energia, te lo agradezco muchísimo. Síguele en portugués, en inglés, en español, como quieras. Tú eres el invitado. Muchísimas gracias por eso. Por favor, adelante.
Muchísimas gracias, Fernanda. Thank you very much. I think I'd rather do it in English because, you know, I don't speak Portuguese, and my Portuñol might not work out. So I will share with you some slides that I think can illustrate the points that I will be discussing. And the first few, by the way, before starting, not only thanking Fernanda, I wanted to say that I'm very happy to do this activity with Fernanda and with FGV, which is sort of our ally, and we have been working the last few years together, doing events in Houston and trying to develop a research agenda together. So it's great to be connected through this online webinar or class. So very quickly, because you know this, and I want to focus in Latin America. Of course, this is a historical collapse of the oil market. I mean, you have to go before the Second World War, and you have to go to the wars, the First World War and the Second World War, to see a collapse of demand of this magnitude. If you see the last few decades in world history, you don't see anything of this magnitude. And even the financial crisis, it's tiny compared to this, in terms of, this a fall in demand of about the projection is about 9% of total demand, and the financial crisis was 1%. So this is huge. Of course, in the worst moment, it was 30 million barrels of declining demand. One beautiful thing about oil demand recently is that it's about 100 million barrels per day. So it's very easy to do percentages. And so about 30% decline in demand at its worst moment. But the projection at the end of the year is about 9%. That has been revised a little bit for better, but it's around 8 to 9%. And of course, the worst part is in this quarter that we are witnessing. And the idea is that we will have a significant recovery later on, and that and of course there are very different forecasts, because there is massive uncertainty. I mean, we don't know how fast the world economy is going to recover. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave of contagion in the fall of the northern hemisphere, or in the winter. And so depending on many of these factors, we don't know if there's going to be a vaccine, etc. We do know, for example, that things like aviation is not going to recover quickly in almost any scenario. And we also know that this is going to be one of the worst recessions, or even a depression, that we have witnessed in the last 100 years or so. So it's going to be bad, but we don't know how bad and how long lasting is going to be the recovery. And of course, that this happened in a moment in which already there was a sort of an oversupply of oil. And there was sort of a short-lasted war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, because the Russians didn't want to comply, or didn't want to cooperate with OPEC and Saudi Arabia at the beginning. And later, because the demand collapse was so spectacular, and President Trump pressured heavily the Saudis to cooperate, they came up with this agreement of OPEC plus that has been about a cut of about 10 million barrels. That started in May. That hasn't been fully implemented, and we don't know how long. There's going to be a new meeting, and so we don't know how long or if they will change the figure. But it's the largest cut ever accorded by OPEC and other countries. And of course, there is a lot of additional cuts that are, let's call them involuntary, in the sense that they are because of the economics of the oil production. Some barrels have been, some wells have been basically shut because of they were losing money, and particularly in the US. And you can see it here. The US reached a peak production. The US had a spectacular increase in oil production, became the largest oil producer in the world, surpassing Saudi Arabia and Russia, and peaked at 13.1 million barrels per day at the beginning of this year. But since then, there has been a significant decline, and of about 1.7 million barrels. So a very, very, very sharp decline. And partly that has to do with the fact that a lot of the US production is shale production. And not only they have that production has a very steep and fast decline rate, but also a lot of these wells are high break-even wells, and some of them were shut in because of the economics. And you can see the number of oil rigs in operation in the US also collapsed. It didn't collapse as much as it collapsed when the price fall in 2014-16. And now because the productivity now, there were much less number of rigs, but as a percentage is a very large, steep decline. And so production in the US will continue to decline, and that will help balance the market too. Of course, the decline in prices was of historic proportions at its worst. Of course, you have this anomaly of a negative price in WTI on April, but that was for a specific for the oil contracts that were delivered in May. But even if you take the other contracts that never turned negative, the price reached the minimum in nominal terms in the history of WTI that had never been below 10, and in the case of in real terms also the lowest price ever recorded by most measures. So really bad. Of course, the price has recovered, and today we have a price of WTI of 37 and a Brent of 40. That gives some breathing room to the world oil industry. We will see that at Brents of less than 35, there aren't that many barrels that have to be shot in terms of operational cost or lifting cost. But what it does do, continues to do, this low price environment which is still like half of what it was at the beginning of the year. It makes it really hard for investments to proceed in most places that are not the Middle East. And also price volatility is humongous, only comparable to the financial crisis. And of course, this also makes it really hard for oil companies and countries to operate in this environment of high volatility. And here you can see that the break-evens, meaning the price required to for a oil investment, a greenfield oil investment, to recover the investment plus having a basic rate of return, you can see that at prices of Brent of around 35, only on average, the Middle East onshore is below that, and there are barrels in many other areas that are below that, but the average of the other areas is above that. So that basically means that at $35 to $40 of Brent and WTI, almost every single region in the world is in deep trouble in terms of future investment, except for the Middle East. And in terms of narrowing on Latin America, so let's distinguish here two very different issues. Of course, the largest producer by far today is Brazil in Latin America, which is, of course, a big reversal from a decade ago when Mexico and Venezuela were the two largest oil producers. Today, of course, is Brazil, then Mexico, which produces about 1.7 million barrels. By the way, these are figures from BP, so they are dated. So already Brazil was producing more than these, and Mexico was producing less than these, and Venezuela was producing less than these. But these are the last figures that BP sort of produce, and so that those are, that's why they are used to compare. But the main point, the broad point that I want to make here is the following: the two largest producers, which are Brazil and Mexico, are countries in which the oil industry is not as relevant for the size of the economy. So they are big producers, but they are not oil dependent in any way. And in fact, Brazil, by some measures, is just barely self-sufficient, or it has a surplus, but the surplus as a percentage of GDP is relatively small. It's less than 1% of GDP in the sort of the balance of payment of the oil industry in the latest figures that I had. Whereas, and in the case of Mexico, also barely significant as a net exporter. So these two very large economies, the oil industry is really important in both of them, but it's not macroeconomically dependent. They are not macroeconomically dependent on the oil industry. That is not the case of the three following producers, which are Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. These three countries are absolutely dependent. In the case of Venezuela, of course, it has been historically extremely dependent, with more than 90% of exports being oil. But both in Brazil and in Colombia and Ecuador, more than half of the exports come from oil, and they are significant net exporters. So the domestic market, the domestic consumption is relatively small compared to their total production. And in per capita terms, Ecuador is much higher, and as a percent of GDP, much more dependent than Colombia. The other thing to keep in mind, and so those are the net exporters. I'm leaving out Guyana, Guyana has become a producer this year and an exporter this year, and so they are heavily dependent on oil starting in 2020. But Guyana didn't produce any oil last year, so they, even with this collapse in prices, they are doing much better than last year. They're going to be the only economy in South America that will grow very, very fast. In fact, all the others will have a decline in GDP as it is projected. But the difference between Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia is that the starting sort of situation, right? Venezuela was already in a massive collapse, and we will discuss that a little bit further. Ecuador was in very bad shape. They didn't have reserves. They are at the brink of default on their debt. They have a dollarization. So Ecuador is in also very bad shape. In contrast, Colombia is in a much better shape. It's a country that fiscally and macroeconomically was doing much better than the other two. So even though Colombia will suffer, it will be much less dramatic. Of course, I'm talking just about oil, and you have on top of this the COVID crisis that all countries are facing that is unrelated to the collapse of the price of oil. And of course, also the countries that are net importers, like Peru, like Chile, like Uruguay, are actually benefiting from the collapse in the price of oil. Not that much, because consumption today, because of the quarantines, is significantly reduced, but at least they are not macroeconomically negatively affected. And we will discuss Argentina, which is a net importer, but the oil industry plays a big role in Argentina in a moment. So here you have what the consultancy Rystad has for last year for the cost of production. And you can see that the two countries with the largest cost of production are Colombia and Venezuela. And that means that they are the ones who are most affected by the reduction in prices in terms of current production. And you can see it here in this next slide. The countries that at a price of less than $35 per Brent, so slightly lower than it is today, have to cut production are Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico. We will see that Mexico actually is not doing it. Mexico is producing despite that it's losing money in some of its production. But in the case of Brazil and Argentina, in the production that is already developed, the cost of production are relatively low. Brazil had some high cost production that I think most of it they already closed that production. And Argentina has also some very small production that is sort of out of the money. So you notice here in this graph that the percentage of production that has to be shut in because of low prices in terms of current production is not that significant in Latin America. But if the prices had stayed or go back to the levels of $20 WTI, then it's a massacre. then you see that about half of Latin America's production is out of the money. So hopefully that's not going to happen. And of course, for that to have a significant effect, it would have to last for a while. But notice that even though, for example, a country like Brazil or Argentina are not significantly affected by their current production, they can be significantly affected if the prices stay lower in terms of the break-evens. This is a study by the consultancy Welligence, and I have had previous presentations with Brazilian colleagues that are more optimistic than this. They don't believe that it's going to be as bad in terms of declining in investment in Brazil because of the productivity of the pre-salt and the decline in the break-evens. But having said that, there is no doubt that for future projects, I mean, there is a massive cut of investment in the region. About half of the planned investments for this year and the next have been announced that are going to be cut. So it's going to be hard for the oil industry in the region. And notice there that Mexico has very little cuts, because in the case of Mexico, it's mostly Pemex, and the president of Mexico doesn't want to cut investments. Let's see if he can continue pursuing that policy. So let me move on to some countries, right? So Venezuela is, of course, the catastrophic story in the oil industry today. This is a country that used to produce in 20 years ago, when Chavez came to power, 3.4 million barrels and was the largest producer in Latin America. When Maduro came to power, produced about 2.6 million barrels. And before US sanctions were implemented at the beginning of 2019, produced about 1.3 million barrels, and today produces around 600,000 barrels. And as we speak, is declining, and I think it could be reaching 500,000 barrels pretty soon. So that means that Venezuela will be surpassed by Colombia, Ecuador, and Argentina as bigger producers than Venezuela, which is, astonishing for someone like me who was born in Venezuela. And Venezuela has one of the largest resource endowments of the planet. And during these years of high oil prices, Venezuela's production has collapsed, and so it's now a minor producer. And the situation is going to get worse because of a combination of factors, US sanctions, the economy because of the low oil prices, and because of US sanctions, the government will receive less than $5 billion of oil revenue. And basically that means that they will have to face very tough choices. Yesterday, they implemented a massive increase of many million percent increase in the price of gasoline that was almost zero in Venezuela, close to zero, because they cannot afford to keep importing gasoline. I mean, they just imported gasoline from Iran at international prices and had to sell it at these very reduced prices. So they increased the price, and they created a two-tiered system. So you can see, according to Baker Hughes, there are about 12 oil rigs in operation in Venezuela. In fact, my information is that they are even less than that. But in any case, Venezuela requires much more rigs to, at this level, Venezuela will have a decline of production of between 10 and 20% per year if it has so little number of rigs. Colombia, which is a country, Colombia has very small oil reserves and a very tough geology. Most of its potential is high cost or in shale that they have been unable to develop because of environmental concerns in the country. And their recent discoveries have been mostly offshore gas. So Colombia is in a tough spot. Their oil industry is in a really tough spot. Having said that, Colombia has a very well managed national oil company. I think one of the best in the world and in the region. Of course, much smaller than Petrobras. By the way, at some point it was the corporate governance, etc. of Ecopetrol is so good that at some point, Ecopetrol, which is a tiny company compared to Petrobras, the market value was above Petrobras. That lasted very little, but that tells you more about how well Ecopetrol is perceived as being managed. But production is going to decline in Colombia, and you can see the decline that happened in 2004 as sort of a reference of, they were production was starting to go up, but I think it will decline again, and investments will suffer significantly in Colombia. And as I said, because the lack of reserves, the high risk, the high cost, in a low price environment, the Colombian oil industry is in trouble. And you can see that the number of oil rigs in operation in Colombia has collapsed to almost zero. And I think that's gonna recover because the price of oil just recovered, but it will be a tough year, a really tough year for the Colombian oil industry. One of their advantages is that, as in Brazil, they had a restructuring of their national oil company during the tough times. They really cut costs and sold some assets, and so they are in better shape to manage this price decline that, for example, of course, PDVSA of Venezuela, but Ecuador or Mexico. Here you have Mexico. Mexico has had a collapse of the oil industry that only Venezuela is worse in the region. Mexico produced similar to Venezuela, significantly more than almost 3.5 million barrels of oil. Today produces about 1.7 million barrels of oil, despite their massive oil reform that attracted tons of companies for exploration in the last 5 years. And but most of that investment is yet to materialize. It's just starting to materialize. By the way, there are some wells being drilled today in Mexico in deep waters and in shallow waters for exploration. So that seems to be continue to happen even during these very tough circumstances. But because of the reversal of sort of some of the policies by President López Obrador, who wants to, as they joke, make Pemex great again and basically focus on the national oil company, the situation is very dire. So think about it. Mexico is one of the most diversified oil exporters in the world, net oil exporters in the world. The oil industry is a tiny percentage of the Mexican economy. To give you an idea, Mexico exports more manufacturing than the rest of Latin America combined, including Brazil. So it's a very open economy, very manufacturing driven. However, for Mexico, the sort of the weak spot is that the government is still somehow dependent on fiscal revenues, but on top of that, their national oil company is in red, is in deep trouble. And the government wants to keep helping it. I mean, and particularly this president is obsessed with helping Pemex. And so to give you an idea, Pemex lost $18 billion with a B last year, and in the first quarter lost $20 billion just in the first quarter, and that was before the collapse of the price of oil of the magnitudes that we saw in April. So it's really bad, and their bonds were the ratings was declined to junk status. So Pemex is in trouble, and it's dragging the Mexican government with it, and the president doesn't seem to care. In terms of he is continuing ahead with the production plans. Now they seem to be at least reducing some of the drilling plans and going full steam ahead with building a massive refinery that is going to be a money loser. And here you can see that Mexico breaks the trend of all the other figures that I showed you about oil rigs in operation. Mexico's oil rigs are actually up compared to the past few years, and it's the country in Latin America with the highest number of oil rigs in operation today. Most of those oil rigs are operated in Pemex operated fields, but as I said, there are a few that are exploratory wells and wells that are rigs that are operated in private projects. Argentina is a country that has had a very bad performance in the oil industry because of the policies of Cristina Kirchner and the Kirchners in the past. They have this massive potential in Vaca Muerta, which is a unconventional play, or probably the second best after the United States. But it's a relatively high cost opportunity, and because of the issues in Argentina in terms of property rights and macroeconomic crisis, they are in the brink of default again. They are actually in default again for the, I think, 8th time. So the macro problems plus the policy problems of Argentina, the fact that they renege on the deals that they make with oil companies every few years, has made it difficult to develop. Having said that, Vaca Muerta was starting at least last year to grow, and you can see here that the number of oil rigs in Argentina was relatively high because of Vaca Muerta compared to other. And remember that in shale you require more activity in terms of wells to sustain production. But you can see now that because basically Vaca Muerta, there is no chance. I mean, Vaca Muerta is muerta, is dead at this price environment, even though the Argentinian government has set a domestic price, barril criollo of $45 to help Vaca Muerta, but that's not gonna keep it alive. It's going to continue to be sort of a zombie area until the price of oil goes back to high levels. Ecuador is also in deep trouble. Ecuador was trying to reform their oil industry to change from service contracts to production sharing contracts or profit sharing contracts. But they are in a very tough spot. As I said, as an economy, they are in the second worst position after Venezuela, and the oil industry is in a really tough spot to attract investment under these circumstances and with the type of contracts they have, the things that the Ecuadorian government cannot pay the service companies and owes them a lot of money. Brazil, I'm not going to speak about Brazil because you have Fernanda that will do a much better job than me. But just to put it in perspective, as I said, Brazil, even though current production is in very good shape, except for a tiny bit, you can see that still there isn't that much activity in terms of oil rigs for the past few years, and so the expectation of significant additional investment in Brazil has yet to really materialize, and if the low price environment continues, this could affect the plans of production, even though the current production has been spectacularly, wells have been spectacularly productive, new investment have to happen. And so with that, just to close with the remarks, this is a very tough time for the Latin American oil industry. It turns out that Brazil is in better shape than probably any other country, and of course it's the largest oil industry at this point, because first, the country is not dependent on it, although, for example, the state of Rio de Janeiro is, it's going to be fiscally affected, and of course you know more about that than I do. But it's not a crisis of the magnitude that is for the other countries, the specific oil industry crisis. And also, Brazil had done a lot of reforming, both in the national oil company Petrobras and in terms of divesting and changing the rules again to make it more attractive. So Brazil is in less of a difficult spot. But Mexico, who shouldn't be in a deep problem, it is because of Pemex, and Pemex is in really bad shape, and the policies of the president actually make it worse. So Mexico is going to be in a tough spot because of the low oil prices. Of course, Venezuela and Ecuador, terrible situation for both countries, heavily dependent and they will be dragged by their oil industries down. Colombia, tough situation, but a country that is much better able to manage that. And in terms of the Argentina, the problem of Argentina is not macroeconomic right now because they are net importers, and it's not about current production of Argentina that is viable economically. The problem is that Vaca Muerta, which was their hope for attracting massive investments, and there were tons of companies committed to very large investment in Vaca Muerta, then all of a sudden that's basically not going to happen. And so we are in a tough situation also in Argentina. So very tough times for the Latin American oil industry. And with that, I open to questions or comments.
Thank you, Francisco. Let's keep it in English, all right? Can we just remove?
Yeah.
Oh,
sure.
Great.
I would.
Just to keep beautiful on the recording. Great. Well, so actually, you said that mostly of those countries, the problem actually mainly is the government. You know, of course, Venezuela, the problem comes from the government. Mexico, the problem comes from AMLO, López Manuel, and all the problem that it comes from Pemex. Argentina, it's not exactly, the problem is not the government right now, but we know that the institutions that come from some time. And here in Latin America, I have we know that we are always struggling about to open more for the market, our economics to open for the market, and this lack of democracy that our governments they are used to be, as to say, we cannot get rid of this lack of the democracy that we have. So said that, you said very well that Brazil is the best placed, the one that is best placed right now in this pandemic time. Yesterday we had a huge webinar here at FGV where we heard from the 6 major oil companies that are here in FGV. I'll send you the video later. And they said it was Chevron, Total, Petrobras, the big Shell and Equinor. And they said they will keep their investments in Brazil. The answer of the webinar, the answer that I wrote was that what Brazil has to do for you to keep your investments in Brazil. And they said that they will keep their investments in Brazil, but they are waiting and they are expecting the government to make some moves on the regulation. They are not expecting any aid, any help from the government, but moves on the regulation, on the contracts and things like that. So it depends on some regulatory reforms that you well said regarding Brazil. Said that, I have 2 questions here from the students, but I would like you to hear from you as an expert in Venezuela. What would save the oil industry in Venezuela, and what would save, in your opinion, the oil industry? I will ask for Mexico because I come from Mexico. It's my country. So I would like you to tell us what would save the oil industry in Venezuela, which I know it's much deeper than the crisis that we are facing right now. I know, and I would like you to tell us about it. And what would save the crisis, and what would save Pemex in the oil industry in Mexico as well?
Sure. So yes, I mean, Venezuela and Mexico, by the way, both countries should be producing much more oil than they are producing, right? Mexico has a very significant potential. If you see the number of wells drilled on the Mexican side of the Gulf of Mexico, and if you compare that to the U.S., it's a tiny fraction of what has happened in the north side, and the geology, by most accounts, is as good as the one in the U.S. So Mexico is a country that has a potential to increase their reserves from the 7 billion barrels that they are today, that are significantly below Brazil's today, but they could be, they could go up to 50, 60 billion barrels if there is enough investment. The problem is that they were doing what they needed to do, right? They opened up the sector. They did a reform inspired in the Brazilian.
Yes, they were here. They were here studying.
Exactly, they studied the ANP and all the reforms. They didn't have politically the sort of support to reform Pemex the way Petrobras was. They couldn't, for example, list Petrobras in the stock exchange or reform it as deep as Petrobras. But other than that, they created an independent regulatory agency. They beat these contracts that were amazingly successful. I mean, if you see the sort of
a year ago, yeah.
Yeah, López Obrador was elected in 2018, but between 2015 and 2018, they did these bidding rounds that were, basically about $150 billion in new investment was sort of committed to. But the thing is that they only open exploration. They didn't sell, assets in current production. So most of the effect will take years. And the problem is that the president, first, he opposed the energy reform. In fact, I joke with my students that, President López Obrador had a heart attack the day the reform was approved. And it might be coincidence, but maybe not, right? So he really dislikes the energy reform. The only reason why he's not canceling those contracts is because he was told by his advisors that was going to be a big mess and very costly.
But he stopped the contract. He stopped the contract in the end of the year.
He stopped the new contracts, the bidding of. He stopped all the bidding rounds in every contract. He stopped the joint ventures by Pemex. He stopped everything. And the only thing that he's willing to do are some service contracts like the ones Pemex used to do. But he at least didn't cancel the existing deep water contracts, for example. And so they are proceeding with the exploration wells in some of these big investments. And as you mentioned about the case of Brazil, if you talk to the heads of the top IOCs, they tell you that they will continue with their exploration plans. Of course, that's just a tiny fraction of money at the beginning. I mean, it's big, but it's not that big for those companies. And it opens up sort of an option to develop those resources. But I think they will be very cautious in the next phase, of sinking the very large investment that they need to develop those fields. So that's that's about Mexico. The key, of course, in Mexico is that the national oil company is in very bad shape. They need to spend tons of money in deep waters that the national company has never done, and they don't have the expertise. And the company is, as I said, is the most indebted oil company in the world. $105 billion of the external debt. So we know the feeling.
Petrobras used to be in this place.
Used to be, exactly. But Petrobras did a major restructuring. Pemex didn't, no? And they didn't. And the sad thing is that they had the tools for the first time because they changed the constitution. They allowed for private investment. They could have done something like Petrobras, but they didn't do it. And now the president wants to actually go in the opposite direction, right? He's like sort of a little bit like Lula, with these massive plans for refining. And we know how costly that was in Brazil. So let's see, but I'm unfortunately pessimistic. I think he will become more pragmatic because he will have to. But I think Mexico and Pemex are going in the wrong direction. In terms of Venezuela, I think, of course, with the current regime, it's almost impossible to recover the oil industry. They are, at this point, by the way, very pragmatic. They are trying to attract private investment. They are trying to change the legal framework, even though they have been, totally against the private sector. But they are desperate, so they're trying. But the thing is that oil sanctions and of course their reputation and all the problems, it's a nightmare to operate in Venezuela today. You have massive lack of security in the oil fields. You have because of the lack of investment in infrastructure, you have accidents, you have oil spills, you know, environmental, there's a massive environmental mess in Venezuela. So it is very tough. And companies, by the way, in Venezuela are only allowed to be minority partners of the national oil company that is in total disarray. So, but what could happen in Venezuela? Well, the opposition led by the president of the National Assembly, you know, an interim president recognized by many countries, that is Juan Guaido, has a plan to invest about $100 billion, $100 to $120 billion in the next 7 to 10 years, and to add 2 million barrels of capacity that will bring Venezuela to about 2.7 million barrels. That is totally doable in terms of the, you know, the engineering and even the economics. Even some people are pessimistic, but I think there is a lot of possibility there, even at a relatively low price environment. But the thing is that the institutional changes that Venezuela needs to do, you know, Venezuela wants to do the same thing, you know, create an independent regulatory agency, basically do bidding rounds, all those things. But it will take time for that to actually function. And of course, the reputation of the Venezuelan government is so bad that, you know, it will take
it's risky.
A little bit to trust them. But I think something will happen. It will depend on political stability. But at least the opposition of Venezuela has the law, has a project of law that is very, very reasonable. And I know, because of the geology of Venezuela, the big oil companies, even though they are pretty worried about the risk of Venezuela, they still think that is one of the most attractive oil provinces in the world, and therefore they have to be there.
Sure, it's the biggest reserve in the world, so it has to be. Well, actually, I have a question here from Beto Saab. It's one of my students from the MBA. Actually, he wants to know, yesterday, from some months, we have been hearing from the president of Petrobras saying that cash is king. Cash is king is his slogan to preserve the cash of the company, and all the reform that Petrobras has been doing, as you said, that Petrobras has been doing. So since the beginning of the pandemic, he changed this slogan, and he's saying cash is God nowadays. So in that way, Alberto is asking if you think that the IOCs will attract a higher demand to capture low-end and resources. Petrobras just captured some money on the stock market 2 or 3 weeks ago, and global titles, and this will stimulate all other companies to do the same, and in that sense, it would decrease the internal taxes in capturing those monies in the world. How do you see that?
I mean, from my sense, from talking to oil executives here, is that they are really, really worried about the current environment, right? Most of their companies have done some restructuring, not as massive as Petrobras, that, you know, started in a really tough spot and did a lot of divesting and a lot of restructuring. But they had done some cost reduction, you know, during the low oil price environment of 2014, 2016, 17. But having said that, they are really worried about the magnitude of the price collapse, combined with all these uncertainties. For example, the European companies, as you know, were in a much more aggressive movement towards the energy transition, you know, Shell becoming a much more natural gas-based company, BP making this announcement of carbon neutrality, and so these companies are very concerned, you know, about major investments in very large projects with long-term, you know, maturity production, like for example a greenfield in Brazil, or an Orinoco Belt extra heavy project in Venezuela. For example, many of these companies have left Canada because of the CO2 emissions in the Canadian tar sands. So this is a new world in that sense. You know, companies have two things at the same time that this using to in the past that wasn't the case, right? They had periods of low oil prices that they had to manage, but now they facing two things at the same time. On the one hand, the low oil prices, and on the other hand, the pressure from their shareholders and their own sort of concerns about the energy transition. So I think capital allocation will be very cautious in the next couple of years. I think companies will be very careful, and I do think that they will be very careful with their cash. They will try to conserve cash. The other thing, of course, these things can change relatively quickly. For example, if remember that in the last few years, what was happening was that a lot of the oil majors were focusing on the U.S., which was a big change,
cash
right?
flow, because the shale gas represent cash flow. Quick
exactly,
cash flow.
very quick cash flow. And so if the price of oil goes up again, that will
go back.
They will go back, and because one of the beautiful things for them of the shale is that it's a short cycle investment, right? You invest and you recover your money in like 2 years or 3 years. Even though it's a high break-even compared to other, compared to a developed field in a big field, a productive field like a pre-salt, but in terms of the short cycle, it's very short cycle.
Yes.
So you don't feel that you are stranding assets if the energy transition advances fast or whatever. So I think it depends a lot on those factors. But in the end, it is a situation that has two big uncertainties, right? One is the price of oil going to be enough to make some of these large investments profitable, and second, will the energy transition be sooner rather than later? American companies are much more, I think, willing to take the risks and much less sort of in a energy transition mode. But it's going to be hard for I think all countries in Latin America to get the size of investments that we were thinking, in the past few years.
That will have, the reading that I did from this is that actually before you just have to see if you are on a boom or a bust of the cycle of the price of the cycle price. But now you have to see where is your geography, as you said. In Europe, the companies are on another way regarding the renewables. So it's another element that was not here before regarding the investments and the allocation of capital. We put another element on this equation.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. By the way, one thing that that I think is important is that in the competition for capital in Latin America, Brazil does have something that stands out, right? The institutional framework of Brazil is pretty strong. The regulatory agency is very prestigious. And the other thing is that Brazil, along with Colombia, is the only country in which we haven't had expropriations and cancellations of contracts.
Yes, and the contracts keep on, and yes,
so that is an advantage because companies do have a memory of events in Argentina, in Venezuela.
Yes. Switching to Spanish. Armando Patrón te ha enviado una pregunta. Francisco, ¿ves algún cambio importante en la industria de refinación en la región del mundo post-COVID que tiendan a desaparecer las refinerías más pequeñas, menos complejas ante la compresión de los márgenes? ¿Que la práctica de home office impacte el consumo de combustibles en el mercado o alguna otra cosa? ¿Cómo lo ves?
Sí, bueno, yo no soy experto para nada en refinación, pero déjame lanzar algunas ideas al respecto. La primera es, Latinoamérica siempre lamentablemente ha estado retrasado en su desarrollo de refinación porque, primero, Latinoamérica tiene el problema de que en la mayoría de los países es un tema tan políticamente sensible dejar a las fuerzas del mercado fijar los precios de la energía, que eso ha hecho que por algunos periodos las refinerías tengan que vender por debajo del precio internacional en el mercado interno. En algunos países eso ha sido dramático, como en Venezuela, pero en otros ha habido periodos en que ha sido importante. Entonces eso hace que para los inversionistas privados invertir en refinación en América Latina, aun cuando teóricamente dieran los números, que en algunos casos no dan, es algo que lo ven siempre lo han visto con cierta cautela, ¿no? Por otro lado, tenemos la competencia del US Gulf Coast, que es el parque refinador más eficiente del mundo, junto con el de la India, y lo tenemos aquí cerca, y ha sido el que ha, digamos, cubierto las necesidades de productos de América Latina en los últimos años. Si tú ves la producción de refinados en América Latina, no ha sido capaz de cubrir la demanda, el consumo de nuestros países en los últimos 10 años, para nada ha sido entonces, no soy, digamos, especialista en el tema. El negocio de refinación, el otro asunto es que el negocio de refinación es un negocio que tiene, obviamente, los márgenes oscilan mucho, pero no es un negocio como el negocio de upstream, en que hay rentas, es decir, hay ganancias extraordinarias. El negocio de refinación es un negocio en que hay que ser súper eficiente. Y entonces resulta que en América Latina la mayoría de los refinadores son empresas del Estado que no son particularmente eficientes en refinación comparado con los privados. Entonces es un mercado realmente complejo, y yo no soy muy optimista sobre la capacidad de América Latina si tú te pones a ver, excepto por la refinería que se hizo en Brasil y el recondicionamiento de la refinería de Cartagena, prácticamente no ha pasado ninguna inversión importante en refinación en América Latina en los últimos años, y ahora la que viene, que es la de AMLO, la de México, va a ser un desastre económico.
Sí, lo que pasa es que con el precio de barril muy bajo, se supone que ahorita los refinadores deberían de estar llenándose de dinero. Esto pero sí no. Sería el mejor negocio del mundo, pero no, pues la demanda está fregada, pero...
Así es una situación rarísima, ¿no?
Porque es muy raro, sí.
Las refinerías normalmente les va muy bien a los precios
mundo, claro.
Y por cierto, hay una incertidumbre tremenda sobre qué va a pasar con la demanda, por ejemplo, de aviación, de jet fuel. Incluso no queda claro el efecto que esto va a tener sobre la demanda de gasolina, porque, por ejemplo, ya se ha visto en Estados Unidos que en algunos lugares el consumo de gasolina se está recuperando más de lo que se pensaba, por ejemplo, porque la gente no quiere usar transporte público por el coronavirus. Entonces, la gente está usando más automóviles. En fin, hay varios efectos que no sabemos todavía cuáles van a ser.
Bueno. Switching again. Ya estamos terminando. Despite the countries mentioned, is there another country in Latin America that would become a new frontier for investments? I guess you mentioned Guyana
and
Suriname, but Guyana is very strained to Exxon. You know, I guess they are very, very attached to Exxon investments. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, Guyana is a fascinating story, right?
Yes.
Next to Brazil and Venezuela. This powerhouse of, a tiny country of 900,000 inhabitants that will produce, if everything goes well, more than 1 million barrels of oil. So in per capita terms, it will produce more oil than Kuwait in per capita terms. It will be the largest producer in the world in per capita terms. And even though the contract is very favorable to Exxon because it was an exploration contract, etc., they will keep about half of the revenue. So eventually, this is going to become one of the richest countries in the world. And
if everything goes right.
Exactly. So that is a very important qualifier. As you know, oil booms tend to create a lot of problems for countries in terms of the resource curves and all those things. And we have the experience of countries, for example, that were as poor as Guyana, like Equatorial Guinea, that end up in a big mess. And by the way, they just had an election that hasn't been decided, and so you already are starting to see the difficulties in Guyana. Having said that, it's a very attractive. It's almost like the pre-salt in terms of it's a very high productivity, high quality oil. Exxon is finding oil in those blocks, but as you say, it's concentrated. It's Exxon with Hess and the Chinese, but it's Exxon is the operator and it's the biggest player in the country, and they haven't seemed to be finding that much oil outside of the Exxon blocks, right? So let's see. In Suriname, there is also a lot of expectation that Suriname might have some potential big discoveries. So these two tiny countries that most people even forget that they are in South America for a variety of reasons now will become relevant players.
It's a good thing for our an article from us. We can write, Francisco, what can goes wrong in Guyana. Exactly. I invite you to write with me. What can goes wrong in Guyana? Well, Victor is asking, can you imagine a disruption in the Mexican energy section that forces current government to change its energy division? What do you think? Something happening in AMLO's mind?
I think that my experience, I have been studying, what the oil policy in Latin America, for the last 20 years, 30 years. And what you typically see is that governments eventually become pragmatic, right? I mean, Latin America, the state of mind of most politicians and even the general public is resource nationalists, right? Most countries would prefer to develop their resources with national oil companies, and they are always suspicious of foreign capital and the like. Some countries more than others, but the typical mentality is very resource nationalist. Having said that, they have in the last few years we have had the most open ever in the history of the oil industry in Latin America, because, well, ever at least since the 1960s, because national companies were in bad shape economically because of the low oil prices. Most countries need an investment. So I think that eventually that will also play a role in Mexico. I think AMLO will have to become more pragmatic. But for now, he seems to be totally stuck on his ideas of going back to the 1970s and having a very large national oil company. It turns out that that's not going to happen. I mean, Pemex had an oil field called Cantarell that produced 2.2 million barrels by itself, and generated massive rents because it was a low-cost field.
That has been producing since a lot of time, right?
It had been producing in the 70s, but it collapsed in the last 10 years, and now produces less than 200,000 barrels. So they are not going to. I mean, unless they have a discovery like that in Pemex, and that allows for everything to go back to the old glory days, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Guilherme Paiva is asking you, having in mind what you said in the lecture regarding oil industry making market of Latin America, do you expect that another sorts of energy sources would increase the supplies to attend our energy demand? Which one would you bet for the Latin America energy transition context?
Well, we in Latin America, of course, we sometimes forget that we are the continent of the subcontinent with the largest use of renewables because it's hydro, right? We have
Brazil especially.
Brazil, Paraguay, Venezuela, Colombia. These are countries all that have sometimes more than 50% of their energy. It comes from hydro. So. And of course, hydro has sometimes the issues of, and now with climate change can even become worse with, El Nino and rainy seasons and the like. But in general, we have a very renewable matrix compared to other regions of the world. On top of that, we have plenty of gas potential, right? The region has underdeveloped their gas resources. Sometimes, the issue is domestic pricing. Sometimes has been the price. The international price hasn't been attractive enough. But for example, Argentina has some of the largest shale gas resources in the planet. And if they figure out how to develop them, that will be an important thing. The region should be much more interconnected, and we should have more capacity to export and import gas. Brazil has to figure out how to use the pre-salt gas for the country. Bolivia is in a tough spot because Brazil and Argentina need Bolivia much less than in the past, but they have a lot of potential. If they figure out the politics and export to Chile and to Peru, you know, they have potential. Venezuela has tons of potential in natural gas. So even though gas is not like, you know, it's not a renewable, it's a fossil fuel, it will play a big role in the at least in the phasing in of the energy transition as oil becomes you know, less demanded, and coal, of course. So I think Latin America has a big role to play in the energy transition on those fronts. There are some areas in which you know, like Chile, that have also massive potential in solar, but those I think are going to be, and Mexico, by the way, that AMLO is also not favoring those. But I think, you know, natural gas will be in the near term the sort of the biggest winner in terms of money invested in the region.
Wow, great. Well, actually, going to our end, I know you have another appointment. Just I know. Just your last words. Here in Brazil, the regulator, ANP, actually the industry has been asking and demanding the regulator for some measures regarding reducing royalties for a while, and other measures to help the sector, especially the onshore. Have you seen the same movements regarding the other countries like Peru, Colombia? Have you seen the other regulators helping the industry, the oil and gas sector, especially on this, actually just on this pandemic thing?
Colombia comes to mind as a country that is also trying to be flexible. I think Peru is also trying. There are other cases like Argentina and Venezuela that claim to be trying. I mean, you know, Argentina has done something that is very unusual for Latin America, which is basically
the price that they
exactly the domestic price higher than the international.
But it didn't work, right?
But it doesn't work because first of all, there is no. I mean, nobody's going to make investments in base of something that they know is unsustainable. Argentina has implemented it in the past and has never kept their promises, and it's only applicable to some, you know, to some production, but it will help some domestic producers in Argentina to survive. And in that sense, almost every country is doing something to help the oil industry. But I think the ones who are probably going to do it in a more reasonable way are Brazil and Colombia, which have the best regulatory agencies in the region. Mexico has a very good regulatory agency, but the president, of course, is in a very different position. So.
Okay. Francisco, muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo.
Wow.
Yo sé que tú tienes un otro webinar. Muchísimas gracias a todos aqui em nome del MBA. Muito obrigada pelo seu tempo. Thank you very much for your time. Eu vou deixar depois esse link disponível no site da FGV Energia, no LinkedIn da FGV Energia. The site and the recording of this class will be available on the LinkedIn of FGV Energy, on the site of FGV Energy. Thank you so much in FGV Energy name and in my name and my director, Carlos Quintela. Thank you so much for this class. We learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Happy to be here with you, and hope we can do it in that direction, and then you teaching here at Rice, given that at least the pandemic has allowed us to become much more aware of the use of this resource.
I don't need to go to Houston, right?
Exactly.
Well,
you did come, but now you don't need to.
All our plans. I had the ticket to go. Actually, everything was. Anyway, thank you so much again. We talk to you later. Bye. Thank you. Thank you. Gente, obrigada. Boa noite. Tchau, tchau.